In this lesson, we'll talk in detail about the Kolb experiential learning cycle. The Kolb cycle is a method of reflective thinking, which is foundational to prior learning assessment. What we learn today will lay the groundwork for much of the rest of our course. To get us thinking reflectively, let's do a mental activity. This activity is called What, So What, Now What? And it will push us to move outside of our comfort zone with our thinking. To begin, let's set some ground rules. I'll introduce a topic and we'll use the method. It's a basic way to promote discussion that begins with reviewing the details of the experience and moves toward critical thinking, problem solving, and creating an action plan. Now let's choose our first topic for discussion. Then we'll progress through each of these questions. What? So what? Now what? For the first time through this activity, I want you to think about the first training course you completed in your career. Maybe it was basic training for a branch of the armed forces. Maybe it was a 30-minute or even shorter supervisor-led introduction to the computer system. Perhaps it was new employee onboarding. For the purposes of this activity, think about the first training you ever completed. Ready? Here we go. We'll start off with what. What is descriptive? It includes facts like what happened and with whom. Pause the lecture here to think about the what of the first training course you completed. Now let's move on to so what. So what is a shift from descriptive to interpretive. It introduces the meaning of the experience for each participant. It includes the feelings involved and the lessons learned. It also gets at the why of what happened. Pause the lecture here to think about so what. Now we'll move on to now what. Now what is contextual. It's seeing the place of the situation in light of the big picture. It involves applying the lessons learned or insights gained to new situations. It also involves setting future goals or creating an action plan. Pause the lecture here to think about the now what. Nice job! Are you ready to play one more time? This time, I want you to choose the topic. Pause the lecture here and mentally go through the steps. What? So what? Now what? Now that we've warmed up with some reflective thinking, let's dig into the first section of today's material, all about the Kolb experiential learning cycle. The Kolb experiential learning cycle is named for its creator, David Kolb. David Kolb is a social psychologist and educational theorist whose interests focus on experiential learning and professional development. In 1984, he presented a cyclical model of experiential learning. This is a method of reflective thinking and writing, and it's foundational to prior learning assessment. Much of the work that you'll do in this course and others in the program will be structured using this cycle. The handout titled Kolb Experiential Cycle Guiding Questions will help you through each step of the cycle. An important part of learning is articulating and evaluating what you learned, because your brain integrates new learning into the mental structures of what you already know. Reflection is the way to build and cement your learning into those structures. Think of your brain as a palace with many rooms, and you keep adding in more furniture. In the next few slides, we'll talk about a mental model for reflecting on learning, the Kolb experiential learning cycle. We'll use that handout I talked about as we go. You'll want to keep the handout for reference throughout this course and the rest of the program. The first step of the Kolb experiential learning cycle is concrete experience. Concrete experience is the actual event. Kolb maintains that learners should become actively involved in the exploration of the learning experience if they're to get the most out of it. This can involve drawing up a checklist of things that the learner should try to do, such as active observation of what's going on, producing a log or a record of some sort, and formulating appropriate questions. Questions surrounding the identification of the event or learning experience can be things like what was done, why, when, where, how long, were there others involved, and the depth and breadth of the experience. The verbs that you'll want to use when writing about this step include worked, created, prepared, implemented, conducted, or produced. As an example, someone may have learned a shortcut in completing a form for work. In this step, you'll describe a learning experience or product that illustrates a competency or a grouping of competencies. Explain what you did or applied that shows your learning of the competency. Write about the experience that shows my learning is preparing such, or the product that demonstrates this competency is. Step 2 is reflective observation. These are the thought processes and patterns or trends of the experience. The learner then relates this experience to other experiences in his or her life. This is generally acknowledged to be the most difficult stage of the Kolb cycle, but it's probably the most crucial of all. Students and practitioners should reflect on what they learned, how they learned it, why they learned it, whether the learning experience could have been more effective, and so on. Discussion of these reflections with one's instructor can prove extremely helpful, as can discussion with one's peers, either informally or at a formal debriefing session of some sort. The questions surrounding this portion of the cycle are more evaluative. What worked? What didn't work? Are there patterns or similarities or differences? The verbs that you'll want to use include observed, watched, noticed, saw, thought, or discovered. Discuss what you noticed or observed. Analyze what you learned in experiencing or producing. Discuss what expertise you gained or expanded, such as, in experiencing, I noticed this, or in producing, I discovered that. When appropriate, relate what you learned to the program goals and competencies. This is like the furniture that you're moving into the palace. The third step is abstract conceptualization. This is a stage that is very often left out of experiential learning programs. But again, it's extremely important if the learners are to gain the maximum possible benefit for such learning. The main object of this stage is to link the actual learning experience with the theories that were meant to underpin it, and/or with greater understanding of the theories that the learning experience was designed to illustrate. Again, discussion with one's instructor can prove extremely helpful during this stage of the Kolb cycle, as can discussion with fellow learners. The questions during this stage of the cycle include, what insights have I had? Is this the same observation as with other experiences? What theories or principles have I formulated as a result? Use verbs such as concluded, theorized, found, realized, deduced, or learned. Evaluate your learning as it relates to a bigger picture, to a theory posed by an author or your own ideas. Discuss any rules, theories, or concepts that apply to this learning. Write about conclusions you've drawn from the experience or how creating the product helped you to realize. The ability to generalize is a key difference between a typical user and a problem solver. It is the essence of learning from experience. This is like the rooms of the palace. The fourth and final step of the Kolb experiential learning cycle is active experimentation. Active experimentation is the point in the cycle where the learner applies the learning from the experience to new situations. The learner develops strengths of learning for future experiences or events. The questions for this portion of the cycle are, how can I use this learning in another situation? Would this knowledge be useful in another situation? How can I make predictions based on this knowledge for future experiences? You'll use verbs such as used, updated, applied, tried, implemented, or changed. What happened as a result of the experience, reflection, and learning? What new ways did you create? You might write, based on this experience, I changed the way I... You could discuss why the learning is valuable to your job role. You might write, I used the product in my work to... At this point, you should be fairly comfortable with each of the 4 steps of the Kolb cycle. Obviously, I don't expect you to be an expert at this point, but you'll get lots of practice using it in this course and in the rest of the program. So now it's time to talk about the assignment. After completing the readings, the self-assessment, and going through this lecture and all the related activities, you'll use the Kolb experiential learning cycle to write a 1-page reflection essay about what you've learned. Begin with the concrete experience, that is, what you did. In this instance, you visited several websites, took a survey, and learned more about your own learning style. Use the guiding questions to complete the cycle. As a general rule of thumb, you should expect that each step of the cycle will comprise approximately 1/4 of your essay. In other words, you should devote 25% of your writing to concrete experience and 25% of your writing to reflective observation, and so on. Well, that's it for this lesson. Your instructor will review this reflection essay and will then provide you with detailed feedback. This is like a practice run for future reflection essays. You'll use the Kolb experiential learning cycle in every course in this program.